Sherlock Holmes, A Betrayal in Blood by Mark A. Latham. Chapter 1. A Strange Tale. Good heavens, Holmes, I said. You're not really reading those, are you? I was astonished, upon rising for breakfast, to find my friend Sherlock Holmes already busying himself with a large dossier, a plethora of newspapers, and numerous case files. Holmes was not known for rising early, and certainly not for working at such an hour. Holmes made some utterance and waved me away, and I looked about the room in despair. He had clearly been active for some kind, given the abject disarray of the Baker Street rooms, which had been put back to order only days ago following the rather trying events following his return to London from his long exile. Since then, I had resolved to spend some time at Baker Street to ensure no further attempts might be made on Holmes' life. The object of his latest obsession was queer indeed. That the skeptical and pragmatic Sherlock Holmes I had known for so long would pay any heed to the so-called Dracula papers was a puzzle. This collection of documents detailed the battles of a crew of vampire hunters against a fiend who took the form of a Transylvanian nobleman. The events had unfolded between May and November of the previous year, 1893, in London, Whitby, and Transylvania itself. Composed by numerous hands, collected together, the Dracula papers exonerated the hunters themselves, whilst damning the late Count Dracula. 4 young men had accompanied one Professor Van Helsing and Mrs. Mina Harker, née Marais, on a mission to rid the world of Count Dracula, purportedly a blood-sucking vampire from Transylvania. This much I knew from the newspapers, which called the men intrepid vampire hunters, or the crew of light. Of these men, one had perished in the adventure, Quincy P. Morris, of Texas. The other still lived in England, and had become celebrated in the public eye. Jonathan Harker, a solicitor and husband to Mina, Dr. Jack Seward, who had the running of the lunatic asylum at Purfleet, and Arthur Holmwood himself, now Lord Godalming. This last was a tragic figure, for there was a deceased girl in the case, Lucy Westenra, who had been Lord Godalming's betrothed, and he himself had cut the head off the poor girl's corpse in order to stop her from rising from the grave. The affair had taken a great toll on the young lord, who had not been seen in public since, though he had married surprisingly soon after Miss Westenra's demise. Only the most sensationalized version of the events had thus far made it to the public attention. The inquest into the facts of the case had dragged on for no small time. Most people expected the crew of light, particularly its illustrious leader Van Helsing, to be exonerated of any wrongdoing, and perhaps even to receive some honor for its roles in Count Dracula's defeat. I had heard a little more of the details from idle chatter at the club, but it was certainly not the kind of thing that Sherlock Holmes would normally concern himself with. I sighed and rang for Miss Hudson. "You will take breakfast, at least?" I asked. "What? Oh, if you like." My friend, so generally enervated by his work, was tired, and that much was plain to see. Dark rings had formed around his eyes, and his sharp features were drawn more than ever, his skin almost luminous in pallor. Holmes had been back at Baker Street not even a fortnight after his miraculous return from death, and the capture of the dangerous villain, Colonel Sebastian Moran. Yet it appeared that a case had already presented itself to Sherlock Holmes, and a strange one at that. A soft rap came at the door, and I finally opened it for Mrs. Hudson. She craned her neck to peer in at Holmes, and frowned when she saw him crouched on the floor in his dressing gown, marooned upon an island of crumpled papers. Then her frown swiftly changed to a smile of unexpected warmth. "It's good to have him back, Dr. Watson," she said softly. "All he has driven me to the traction over the years. It was quite something else without him, wasn't it?" Yes, quite something indeed. Still can't believe he's here, large as life, back from the dead." Her words provoked memories within me, painful memories of one I had only recently lost, one who would not be returning. The sudden thought of Mary took me by surprise in its forcefulness. My expression must have betrayed my feelings, for the landlady looked momentarily distressed. Forgive me, Doctor. Did you ring for breakfast? Will Mr. Holmes eat? I appreciated the change of subject. Even if her concern was more for Holmes than myself, the moment of awkwardness passed. Yes, Mrs. Hudson, I think so. Breakfast would be excellent. Mrs. Hudson! Holmes exclaimed, and in 2 large bounds he was at the door in all his dishevelled splendour, looking like the ghost of a great detective. You may need to be quick about it if breakfast is to be had, for I'm expecting a visitor this morning. Early, I should think. Dr. Watson may have to wait for his toast. Mrs. Hudson closed the door behind her, and I returned to Holmes, who had already begun to pick up newspapers in great armfuls, throwing them over the back of the sofa in an apparent attempt to tidy up. Holmes, why are you reading this stuff about Count Dracula with such relish? And why on earth would you expect a visitor this morning in connection with it? He paused abruptly. Watson, I believe I shall make a detective of you yet. You have deduced that the visitor and the curious case of Dracula are connected. Your absorption in those papers could indicate no other reason. But you're always single-minded in the pursuit of a case. My question stands, however. Why the interest in this matter? It is, after all, already solved. Is it? Holmes' mouth twisted into a little smile. His eyes fair sparkled from within the purplish black sockets born of his months in Europe tracking down Moriarty's circle of confederates. But there was a strength there still. Sherlock Holmes may have been physically exhausted, but his brilliant mind worked as rigorously as ever. I could see I was walking into a trap, but I was so intrigued that I did so willingly. For it was often the only means of extracting the juice of tantalizing case from him. As I'm sure you've seen from yesterday's Times, Holmes, Sir Toby Fitzwilliam himself has exonerated Professor Van Helsing of any wrongdoing, and has spoken in the highest possible terms of the Professor's associates. The Count is dead, though a string of poor victims lie in his wake. The full contents of the Dracula papers are set to be made public any time now, although I see you have found a copy already. What is there to be gained by looking over the facts again? My dear Watson, there is always something to be gained by looking over the facts, especially when they've been presented to me in such a strange fashion. Indeed, while there is nothing here that has not already been seen by the highest authorities in the land, I include Sir Toby Fitzwilliam, whose judgment I believe to be impeccable. The most intriguing fact is that they came to me at all. Just look where they came from, Watson. Holmes handed a card to me, upon which was printed neatly the Diogenes Club, Pall Mall. On the back of the card was written in royal blue ink a single initial, M. Mycroft, I muttered. My interest at once piqued. Sherlock's brother requested aid but rarely, and when he did, it usually heralded excitement or danger. Did he attach a note? There was no need, Watson. It was clear from my brother's very involvement that I was intended to read what he sent me and find something that the authorities had failed to notice. The Dracula papers contained 27 journal entries, letters, telegrams, articles, and sundry reports. In addition, the version Minecraft has given me includes several police reports that will not be included with the papers to be made public. There's also some interesting marginalia, not all in Mycroft's hands. I have read every word twice over and several yards of column inches in the popular press besides, and I believe I have hit upon the crux of the matter. Twice over? When were these delivered, Holmes? I asked. I had dined out the previous night, but I returned at 10:15 while Holmes was playing his violin. There had been no sign of any paper in the rooms then. Shortly after midnight, he replied. Then, you must have been up all night. Really, Holmes? You must learn to look after yourself. As a doctor, Come now, Watson. There will be time enough for that later. Tell me quickly, what do you know of the case of Count Dracula? I disliked the way Holmes dismissed my concern for his well-being, but knew there was little to be done. As much as anyone, I said, sighing. This Dutchman, Professor Van Helsing, a small group of other men, and a woman, Holmes corrected. I was getting to that, yes, and a woman too, Mrs. Harker, I believe. They uncovered a plot by, Oh, well, it's too terrific to describe. A vampire, Holmes interjected again. Yes, well, a plot by a vampire indeed, to gain foothold of his reign of evil here in London. The professor put it to a stop, and has been lauded a hero, while all of London is stirred up over the story. Very true, said Holmes. But tell me, how much credence do you give the tale? Why, had it not been for the ruling of Sir Toby in the court yesterday, I would have scoffed at the notion of a vampire, here or anywhere else for that matter. But you yourself said that Sir Toby Fitzwilliam's judgment is impeccable, so I shrugged, not wanting to admit the existence of the undead to my sceptical friend. Sir Toby was one of the most respected judges in the land, and some said a member of a secret intelligence agency. I wondered in which capacity Mycroft Holmes was acquainted with him. Indeed, which is why there must be more to the story. For as we know, vampires do not exist. The evidence suggests something to the contrary, I said, unless you yourself are now the one twisting facts to suit theories. I tried not to look smug. Holmes somehow managed to look smug enough for both of us. And you believe that is what we have? Facts? Well, are you suggesting that Sir Toby was hoodwinked? I am asserting, most confidently, that he was allowed a popular version of events to become known to the public because he lacks the evidence to disprove it. A man in his position does not need evidence to renounce the word of a Dutch professor, I scoffed. Ordinarily, no. But Abraham Van Helsing is no ordinary academic. I've heard his name several times in the past, most recently while I was on a grave business in Austria. He is a clever man, Watson, a cunning man. There must be more to the story. There must be some reason for Sir Toby to lend his assent to this poppycock, and for my brother to involve me. I believe I have the number of it from the papers, what there is of them. Such strong terms for Holmes suggested he was ruffled. I abandoned any further questioning about Van Helsing for the time being. You do not have all the papers, I said instead. Oh yes, I have all the official material. Then what, Holmes? All in good time, Watson. First of all, be a good fellow and open the door for Mrs. Hudson. A quiet knock came then. There was no elementary trickery in this. Holmes' hearing was sharper than a bat's, and I knew he must have heard the tea rattling a good few seconds before I did. I opened the door and bade the landlady come in. No sooner had she set the tray down than the bell rang downstairs. Oh, dear me, said Mrs. Hudson. Now there's someone at the door. Might I leave you with breakfast while I go and see who it is? Indeed you may, Mrs. Hudson, said Holmes, already exchanging his battering dressing gown for a jacket. But I can save you the bother of the identification. It'll be Inspector Bradstreet of the Scotland Yard. Mrs. Hudson, to her credit, did not look surprised. She went downstairs, and a few minutes later, the bearded Inspector Bradstreet was ushered into the room. I shook his hand and bade him sit, casting a rueful look at the toast rack that would have been ignored until now. For now. Your landlady said you expected me, Mrs. Holmes, Bradstreet said, though I cannot guess how. I was thinking the same thing, said I. A simple matter of timing, Inspector, Holmes smirked. I received the Dracula papers late last night from a certain person in government. The dossier was marked with a stamp of the Scotland Yard's B Division, and given our previous work relationship, it seemed obvious that you would be selected for this interview. As to the timing, the subject is a matter of pressing report. Otherwise, the papers would not have found their way to me at such an unusual hour. Someone wished to give me a head start on the reading, it seems. As such, I knew you would head to Baker Street as soon as you reported to work today. I expect 8 o'clock. The traffic at this time is heavy, to say the least, so I estimated 40 minutes for the journey. You took 30. I congratulate you. Well, I'll be blowed. But as it happens, Mr. Holmes, the journey took 45. It's just that I left a bit earlier than you thought. I'm an early riser, you see, force of habit. I'm afraid you've made a second mistake. Also, the inspector said, drawing a raised eyebrow from my friend, I confess I rather enjoyed that moment, for I do not believe Holmes had accounted for a genuine error. Oh, Holmes said pleasantly enough, despite his obvious, to me, chagrin. You said I would have been sent on account of us working together on that Blue Carbuncle case, among others. But that was some time ago, Mr. Holmes. And there are a few at B Division now who'd remember it. No, when I got in this morning, Mr. Holmes, there was some already talking about you because of this Dracula business. I requested the assignment. Might I ask why? On account of a friend. A very old friend. Cuthbert, said Holmes. At this name, which was new to me, Bradstreet's mouth dropped open. Presently he replied, Why, yes, but how? One detective, Inspector Cockford, is mentioned very briefly in the dossier, scribbled faintly in pencil and clumsily erased. It was a small matter to me to discover that he was formerly the B Division, before serving for some short time in Purfleet Constabulary, which would almost certainly have brought him, as senior policeman, into contact with Professor Van Helsing and his merry band. I could find no further reference to Cockford, nor any police report originating from Purfleet, which is one of several notable omissions in the narrative, and I hope you can illuminate these matters, Inspector. I hope that I did not entertain when you first arrived at my door. Bradstreet beamed as though Holmes had paid him a compliment, though I was fairly certain it had been a slight. I poured some tea and handed a cup to the grateful inspector as he relaxed and began his story. Frank Cockford is an old friend, as I said, Mr. Holmes, and a colleague for some long standing. We worked together in Whitechapel, cut our teeth in the worst vice and murder to be seen in this or any other city. Before we both made our way out of that pit, me to Chelsea and him to Purfleet, over time we drifted apart. Duty and locale have a way of doing that. The last time I saw him, he was in a bad way. He'd taken to drink and was speaking in riddles about some Dutch evil, or set himself in opposition to the law. Holmes shot me a glance. How long ago was this meeting? He asked. It must have been November last. Frank said he'd had a run-in with some gents, including the Dutchman, and to tell the truth, I couldn't get much sense out of him. All I know is something happened, something to do with this Dracula, and it was the ruin of Frank Cockford. 20 years on the force, gone up in smoke. You must have seen him again, or else why seek my counsel? Holmes said. I saw him in the distance 2 weeks ago, though he was gone before I could speak to him. I admit I was a little afraid to approach him. His expression was so severe. I made a few inquiries as to why he looked so down at heel. The regulars at his local pub said that he rants and raves about vampires and crooks and devils, and swears they'll come for him before long. I think the loss of his position has taken its toll on Frank's mind, Mr. Holmes. But even so, if I ever called myself his friend, I would be remiss in not making a few discreet inquiries on his behalf. Holmes pressed his fingers together and stared straight ahead, thinking hard. Finally he spoke. Where's the former Inspector Cockford now? Back where he started, Bradstreet said ruefully. Whitechapel. Then that is where we shall begin. Drink your tea, Inspector. We're going now? I asked, giving voice to the inspector's expression. There's no time like the present, Watson, and on the way I shall educate you in the discrepancies of the Dracula papers. There's a mystery to be solved here, a very great mystery. More importantly, I believe I will soon have the opportunity to match with a truly worthy adversary. And so soon after the last one, such fortune should not favour a man twice in his one lifetime. You are on your second lifetime, I said. Holmes' eyes lit up as he considered the jest approvingly, and at once his tiredness seemed to melt away. How right you are, Watson, he said. How right you are.